Being a funeral assistant is inevitably a morbid job. Perhaps the most morbid aspect about it is that your experience of grief becomes numbed and muted. Screams of desperation and tortured cries of agony all blend into a patchwork of gray boredom. I have been in the business longer than most. I know how horrifically corrupt it can all be. 30 years ago, when I first did the rounds carrying coffins and escorting relatives to and from the funeral parlor, I was shocked to learn that some companies tip the bodies out of the coffins and load countless corpses into a vast furnace, like some scene out of the Holocaust. I fear that if anyone did genetic analysis on the ashes of their loved ones, they would find it was predominantly comprised of wood and other people. But I digress. Make no mistake, in all my decades of experience, I have never witnessed anything which will torment me so much as the funeral of one particular gentleman. It was a beautiful winter's day when I began the drive to the funeral parlor. Tearful but dignified relatives had crowded into the back of the limousine. The usual customs were seen, too, as black overcoats were worn, along with stern faces of apparent wisdom from those more distant to the bereaved, whilst the immediate family struggled to contain their emotions. From what I could gather, the late gentleman had left behind 2 children. I glanced quickly at them in the mirror. Both were staring down through swollen red eyes at the funeral documents. I couldn't blame them. The prices we charge are fairly steep, and there's a lot of administration involved. I turned back to the road. Ominous, black clouds approached in the distance. The delicate winter light which had laced the sky was rapidly fading away into misery. Up ahead, the hearse continued its journey. I squinted to look at the arrangement of flowers, and then I noticed that the lid of the coffin, for just an instant, rattled, and then went still. Were my eyes playing tricks on me? I quickly put it out of my mind. However, as I struggled to remember the sequence of the upcoming funeral, this family seemed to be genuinely moved by the death of the old man, and I wanted to make the whole experience as painless as possible. As it turned out, it was the usual affair. Several minutes later, we pulled up at the parlor, and I stepped outside to open the car doors. Some 12 relatives from my vehicle, and 12 from the other, arranged themselves into an orderly procession. Everyone stood, stationary, eyes staring and mouths shut. I heard the usual quiet sobs, but after a while, they faded away. After a few minutes, my colleagues had the coffin safely on their shoulders. The procession started its journey into the building, and I could already hear the classical music blaring in the main hall. It was a good choice of music. Some people choose devastatingly emotional pieces in their final days, whilst one DJ chose a hardcore rave remix. The latter's funeral was completely surreal. Nonetheless, the coffin was placed at a tilt to the audience, and the top half exposed, so that the audience could see the pale features of their late acquaintance. This man looked utterly white, almost freakishly so. and his puckered lips formed a curious contrast with his luscious silvery hair. Once silence had descended, the raindrops' impact made a loud sound, like a gunshot. Through the windows, I could make out the darkening sky. The wind was picking up, and I knew that later on, howling gales would ravage the town. One of the older relatives, presumably a cousin, made her way to the front of the hall to recount old stories. Her head was stooped, and she looked as if she walked with great effort. Once ready, she began the speech, and began recounting her last experiences with the deceased. I studied the man harder. His skin was deathly pale. Although blotchy, it looked as if something had happened to it. But I couldn't tell what. What I did know, however, was that the skin was stretched taut over the bone, as if it had been eaten from the inside. Suddenly, I thought I saw him twitch, and I was filled with a sense of dread. It seemed that the room went cold, as if possessed by a demonic power. As the woman finished her speech, she began to descend back to her seat. I realized there was a chewing sound, and it was coming from the chest of the old man. Suddenly, the woman turned her head to see the bloody head of a rat emerge from inside the man. She collapsed in spasms, vomiting blood. In hysteria, the audience screamed, fainting and clawing at each other. Then the man exploded. Rats and entrails and organs everywhere. I looked at his eyelids and I could see them open, his face twitching and withering, contorted into a manic grin. He opened his mouth and tried to scream, but all that came out was a thick stream of worms and bile. I bent doubled over and threw up, unable to cope with the despicable scene. Like I said, I have worked at the funeral home for many years now, and I've heard some crazy stories from the people bringing in their bodies, and just the way that the people looked and the different makeup that they had to do sometimes. But I had never, in all my time at the funeral home, seen anything, and I mean anything, like this day. I know that it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I don't know if I can work at the funeral home any longer. I think I'm going to faint.